So, as usual, we'll begin with some prayers, and then we'll do a little bit of meditation related to some of the things we've been learning about, talking about in the previous weeks. So while reciting the prayers, it's good if you can to imagine the Buddha in the space in front, made of light. His whole body and robes and every aspect of the visualization is made of pure, bright, transparent light. So very beautiful, very inspiring. And really try to feel the Buddha's qualities. Feel that you're in the presence of one who has completely transformed his mind, freed his mind from all that is negative, like anger, hatred, greed, jealousy, arrogance, and ignorance about the true nature of things, which are the root of all afflictions and all suffering. So all negative things have been totally removed from his mind, and only positive qualities abide in his mind. Compassion, love, wisdom, patience, and so on. And they are fully developed. And so his view is seeing all sentient beings as like a mother or father sees their child, with great love and compassion, and completely dedicated to helping each and every one of us until we too have transformed our minds, freed our minds from all suffering and its causes, and developed all positive qualities and reached the state of enlightenment just as the Buddha did. So really feel Buddha as someone you can turn to for help, for guidance. You can rely on him, trust him. And especially his teachings, the Dharma. So the Dharma can refer both to the teachings that the Buddha gave, that we're learning about and meditating on, but the real Dharma are the true paths and true cessations in the mind. So when the mind has become free of all afflictions and obscurations, and that's the highest level of true cessation. And the way to achieve that is true paths, the main true path being the wisdom realizing emptiness. So those are the real Dharma, true paths and true cessations. Buddha himself achieved those. He knows how to achieve them, and he can guide us to achieve them as well. And then the Sangha are those who are following this path, who see the value, the truth, the benefit of the Buddha's teachings, and are practicing them and gaining various realizations along the path. So they are, again, trustworthy people we can rely upon to help us in following the path. So imagine the Buddha in front of us embodying all these objects of refuge, and that we're taking refuge in the Buddha not just for ourselves, for our own sake, but for the benefit of all living beings, so that we too can help all living beings and reach enlightenment to be able to benefit them in the best possible way. I go for refuge until I'm enlightened to the Buddha, the Dharma, and the Supreme Assembly. By my practice of giving and other perfections, may I become a Buddha to benefit all sentient beings. I go for refuge until I am enlightened to the Buddha, the Dharma, and the Supreme Assembly. By my practice of giving and other perfections, may I become a Buddha to benefit all sentient beings. I go for refuge until I'm enlightened to the Buddha, the Dharma, and the Supreme Assembly. By my practice of giving and other perfections, may I become a Buddha to benefit all sentient beings. May all sentient beings have happiness and the causes of happiness. May all sentient beings be free from suffering and the causes of suffering. May all sentient beings be inseparable from the happiness that is free from suffering. May all sentient beings abide in equanimity, free from attachment for friends and hatred for enemies. Reverently, I prostrate with my body, speech, and mind. I present clouds of every type of offering, actual and imagined. I declare all my negative actions accumulated since beginningless time, and rejoice in the merit of all holy and ordinary beings. Please remain until the end of cyclic existence, and turn the wheel of Dharma for living beings. I dedicate my own merits and those of all others to the great enlightenment. This ground, anointed with perfume, strewn with flowers, adorned with Mount Meru, 4 continents, the sun and the moon. I imagine this as a Buddha field and offer it. May all living beings enjoy this pure land. Idam Guru Ratna Mandalakam Niryatayami. Now, while we recite the mantra of the Buddha, imagine light flowing from the figure of the Buddha in front of you, the light representing all his excellent qualities and realizations in the form of light. And imagine it coming into your body, filling your body and your mind, and having the effect of purifying all suffering and causes of suffering, ignorance and other afflictions, negative karma and so on. All these get purified, and our positive potential, our good qualities, are nourished, just like when we pour water onto seeds, then they can sprout and turn into plants. So this light waters the seeds of our good qualities so they can grow and turn into actual realizations that enable us to progress along the path. Tayata Om Mune Mune Maha Munaye Soha. 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 So the last couple of weeks we've been looking at mindfulness of feelings, and so I thought we could do some meditation on that. But let's start with meditation on the breathing to help our mind calm down, settle down, become clear, free of other thoughts. So just make sure you're sitting comfortably, but in a good position for meditation, with the back straight, eyes left open a little bit if you're comfortable with that. Otherwise you can close them, but just try to avoid becoming sleepy. We do want to stay awake and alert when we meditate. So that's why it's helpful to keep the eyes open a little and looking down, so there's a little bit of light coming in. So once you've settled into a good position for meditation, then focus your awareness on the breathing. Be aware of each breath as it's coming in and going out. One breath after another. You can count your breaths if you find that helpful. And anytime you notice your mind has wandered away from the breath and is thinking about something else, or paying attention to some sound or anything other than the breath, once you've noticed that, let go of that other object and return your awareness to the breathing. So one way of dividing feelings is into those that are worldly and those that are unworldly or spiritual. So worldly feelings are mainly those that accompany our sense perceptions, seeing, hearing, smelling, tasting, and then tactile or body perceptions. And if we're not careful, if we're not mindful, they can lead to afflictions. Pleasant feelings that accompany any of our 5 sense consciousnesses can lead to attachment, desire, craving, wanting more of those pleasant experiences, wanting the objects that give rise to them. Unpleasant feelings with any of our 5 sense consciousnesses can lead to aversion, hostility, and if we're not careful, it could lead to even aggression, doing something harmful to another being, another person. So these kind of feelings are obstacles, hindrances to our Dharma practice, to our spiritual progress on the path. I just spend a few moments thinking about worldly feelings. Bring to mind some examples you've noticed in your own experience. Try to recognize how they are a hindrance to spiritual practice. And then on the other hand, spiritual feelings or unworldly feelings are helpful for our Dharma practice, and they're actually related to our Dharma practice. They're feelings that occur, for example, when we're meditating or we're engaging in practice. So some examples might be a feeling of happiness when we meditate on loving kindness, or we're just trying to be more loving and kind in our interactions with others, or when we're contemplating rejoicing, appreciating the kindness of others, feeling gratitude, and so on. Or when we work on overcoming some affliction in our mind, like anger, and we're able to let go of that feeling of anger towards somebody and replace it with something more positive. So those are examples of pleasant feelings that occur when we're practicing Dharma. And so those are spiritual feelings. And we may sometimes have unpleasant spiritual feelings. For example, when we're contemplating some topic that's more sobering, like death or the sufferings of samsara, just the whole situation of being in samsara. And so there may be an unpleasant feeling accompanying that, but that's a spiritual feeling, not a worldly one. So think of some examples of spiritual feelings in your own experience, and try to recognize how they are helpful for our spiritual practice, our progress on the path. So with regard to the pleasant or happy feelings, which are the ones we usually want more of, and comparing pleasant worldly feelings and pleasant spiritual feelings, which ones are more satisfying, more meaningful? And if you feel that the spiritual ones are more satisfying, beneficial, meaningful, then see if you can conclude the meditation with a resolution to put more effort into cultivating those feelings and less concern with the worldly pleasant feelings, seeing those as disadvantageous rather than things that we want to have more of. Okay, so there's just a little bit more about feelings, and then tonight we'll move on to the next of the close placements of mindfulness, which is about the mind. So at the end of class last week, we were talking about the example of being stung by a mosquito and having mindfulness of the feeling that accompanied that experience, whether probably most people would have an unpleasant feeling with that experience, but some people might have a pleasant one, like a bodhisattva. It's sort of related to a question I've had for a long time about pain. So when we talk about pain, in my experience, pain seems to be an object. It seems to be an object that is experienced. Like we say, I have pain in my head, or I have pain in my gut, or whatever. It seems to be something there that we are aware of, that we are, so the object of a body sensation, a body consciousness. But then I remember hearing somebody say, no, pain is actually a feeling. Pain is a feeling. And so since Geshe Yeshe himself talked about pain the other day, I thought to ask him. And he said, no, pain is a feeling. It's a subject. Pain is a subject and not an object. And so if we could put the slides up, I thought it might be helpful to try to illustrate this. Because we were also talking about mindfulness of feelings, and how, according to Geshe Kelsang Wangbo, when we have mindfulness of a feeling, it isn't simultaneous with that feeling, but it's at least, one moment later. So, so these two circles represent two moments of mind. So in the first moment, moment A, it's a tactile consciousness, or we could say a body consciousness. It's like an experience we have with our body, feeling sharpness. So, like if a mosquito is sticking its stinger in our flesh, or we're getting a COVID vaccine and the needle is going into our flesh. And so the actual object of that mind isn't pain, but rather sharpness. This is what Geshe-la said. It's, what would we call that object? And he said sharpness. And then, so that's, if you remember from the study of Lorig, each moment of mind consists of primary mind, one of the 6 types of primary minds or main minds, plus a number of mental factors, at least 5 mental factors, the 5 ever-present mental factors, one of which is feeling. And so the smaller circle represents that particular mental factor, the mental factor of feeling. And it's probably a painful feeling. For most people, I think being stuck with a needle or stuck with a mosquito stinger feels painful. And so pain then, what we call pain, is actually the mental factor of feeling that accompanies a main mind, in this case a body consciousness. Does that make sense? Yeah? So when we have a needle coming into our flesh, at that moment there's a body consciousness of the 6 types of consciousness. It's the body or tactile consciousness experiencing sharpness, and part of that experience is a painful feeling. Or if it's a bodhisattva, especially an Arya bodhisattva, then it would maybe a pleasant feeling, blissful feeling. And then in the next moment, or it's maybe several moments later, not the exact next moment, but maybe a few moments later, moment B, this is where mindfulness comes in. So again, according to Geshe-la Kelsang Wangmo, the mindfulness of the painful feeling doesn't occur at the exact same moment, but it occurs later. So it's more like a memory, although it could be very, shortly afterwards. It's a memory of that painful feeling. And that accompanies a mental consciousness. So the second circle is a mental consciousness that's remembering that experience of the needle going into the skin and the painful feeling that accompanied it. And so mindfulness would be, again, it's a mental factor, so it's accompanying that main mind, the mental consciousness, and noticing or observing that, oh, that was a painful feeling. So I think this is how it works. I'm not 100% sure. There could be different versions as well. But I think that is, how mindfulness occurs with regard to feelings. And so I think, Venerable Chunni, you last week you seemed to be wondering about that first experience and what does it experience? What is its object? And so I hope this answers that question. That first moment, it is a consciousness, it is a mind and an awareness, but what it's aware of is that tactile object, sharpness. And there's a painful feeling that accompanies that. I mean, there's also a feeling accompanying moment B, the second moment of mind, because pain, there's a feeling that accompanies every moment of mind, but what that feeling is depends on the person. It could be a blissful feeling, because Venerable Kunga mentioned Annie Karen talking about how when she had a mosquito biting her, she felt blissful because she thought of giving blood to the mosquito, and that made her happy. So it's possible that that later moment in which there's mindfulness of that painful feeling, there could be a feeling of happiness. Oh, I gave a drop of blood to that mosquito. How wonderful, something like that. So I didn't draw all the other mental factors, but there's many other mental factors accompanying each of these moments of mind. So, any questions about that? Melissa?
Since feeling arises from contact, is the feeling is the contact of the moment before is actually the cause. So it would be the main mind of the moment before that had the contact.
You're right. Prior to feeling is contact. That's another one of the ever-present mental factors. So there's always a contact in every single moment. And so just before that moment A in the drawing, maybe that was when the mosquito first stuck its stinger into the flesh, or the nurse is sticking the needle into the flesh. And so there's contact, and then in the next moment, there's feeling about that contact, feeling that's, a response to that contact, although the stinger is probably still there, because the mind changes really, really fast. And so, it's usually several moments of experiencing the same object, and having a feeling about it. So could you keep the slides up on the screen, because I'm going from one to the next. So now the next. Oh no, not right. So this discussion is pertinent to the next of the close placements of mindfulness that we're going to be looking at, and because the third of the close placements of mindfulness is on minds, close placement of mindfulness on minds, and there's a connection between feelings and some aspects of the mind, because as we've seen, pleasant feelings usually lead to attachment. So the mind gets caught up with attachment, and that's one of the minds we need to become aware of in that practice. Then unpleasant feelings usually lead to a mind that's mixed with anger or aversion, and so on. So the more we are aware of feelings, then that will enable us to be more aware of this next object of minds. But before we move on to minds, I just want to read something related to feelings, and this is in the book Following in the Buddha's Footsteps. And it's a quotation from a sutra called the Arya Ratnakuda Sutra. And it describes how bodhisattvas practice mindfulness of feelings. That's quite beautiful. Whenever they experience pleasant feelings, they realize great compassion for all sentient beings who indulge in attachment, and they completely abandon all of their own propensities for attachment. Whenever they experience painful feelings, they realize great compassion for all sentient beings who indulge in animosity, and they completely abandon all of their own propensities for animosity. Whenever they experience neutral feelings, they realize great compassion for all sentient beings who indulge in confusion, and they completely abandon all of their own propensities for confusion. Whatever feelings they experience, they know them all to be impermanent, and experience them as such. They recognize and experience them as unsatisfactory. They recognize and experience them as identityless. So the three marks, or three characteristics of existence, of impermanence and unsatisfactoriness or dukkha, and identitylessness or selflessness. So they have that awareness with all their feelings. But I thought it was really beautiful, the aspect of compassion, thinking of all sentient beings and how stuck they are with their feelings, pleasant feelings leading to attachment, unpleasant feeling leading to hostility, and so on, and strive to overcome their own propensities for those afflictive states of mind so that they can help all sentient beings do the same. Okay, so let's move on to the third of the practices of mindfulness, close placements of mindfulness. This is on mind. And at the beginning of this section in the book, Following in the Buddha's Footsteps, His Holiness says something interesting. Well, he's always saying something interesting, but I found this one particularly interesting. He said, in modern science, external objects form the field of inquiry. In Buddhist science, the inner world, the mind itself, is the main field of investigation. When observing the mind, it could be that one part of the mind is the object, the field of analysis, and another part acts as the observer, observing that mind. Alternatively, one moment of mind could observe the previous moment of mind. So he's saying there's two ways in which observation of the mind may take place. The first way almost sounds like he's saying at the same time, one part of the mind observing the rest of the mind simultaneously, and the other alternative is a later moment observing a previous moment. So that makes me think there are different points of view on what's actually happening when we are practicing mindfulness of the mind, observing the mind. And I had shared with you what Geshe Kelsang Wangmo said, that it's mindfulness happens later, and it's thinking of or remembering an earlier moment of mind. But His Holiness seems to be suggesting that maybe some simultaneous portion of the mind is observing that mind. So it just makes me think that, yeah, there could be different perspectives, different points of view.
That reminds me of the self-cognizer, the self-knower, which Madhyamakas refute up and down. And I've heard His Holiness say things like, don't think that way, because it's absolutely not true.
Yeah, well, yeah, it's true. Madhyamaka doesn't accept self-cognizers, but self-cognizers is a particular type of mind. And yeah, definitely our school doesn't accept that. But that, just because we reject self-cognizers doesn't mean there couldn't be some other aspect of the mind, like mindfulness. I mean, maybe he would say mindfulness or introspective alertness can occur at the same time as the mind and be aware of that mind. I'm not really sure. It's just a little unclear what he's saying here. He's just saying it could be like this or it could be like that, but doesn't go into details with it. Maybe we could ask the Geshes while they're here, see what they say. But it just makes me think, yeah, there's probably different points of view, different assertions, and it's hard to know for sure. You know, unless you had a super, super powerful mind and you could really see what is going on each moment of your mind. And I don't know about others, but my own instinctive kind of habitual sense is that there's an I, there's a me in there somewhere, and that is what is observing the mind. But of course, that's something to be investigated, and we will look more at that later. So anyway, when it comes to mindfulness of the mind, there are different explanations of what is the mind that's the object of this kind of mindfulness. So in our tradition, the Tibetan tradition, or at least the Gelugpa tradition, it's said that mindfulness of the mind is related with the third of the Four Noble Truths, the true cessations. So we'll look at that later. His Holiness explains how that works later. So the first bullet point mentioned, it's Jetsun Chökyi Gyaltsen is the textbook writer for Sangye Monastery. So I have a translation of his explanation of the four foundations of mindfulness. And so in his text, he says that the mind that we are mindful of are the six consciousnesses. So this is the fifth aggregate. Aggregate number 5 of our 5 aggregates are our 6 consciousnesses, 6 primary minds of seeing and hearing, smelling, tasting, the body consciousness, tactile consciousness. And then the 6th is the mental consciousness, which includes all of our thoughts and our memories and our dreams and emotions and so on. That's quite a busy, complex consciousness. But in his text is very, very short and doesn't really explain how one practices mindfulness of the 6 consciousnesses, perhaps my guess is it's just becoming more aware of them as they're occurring. They're happening all the time. Yeah, so just learning to notice, seeing and hearing and smelling and tasting and so on. And also to understand the nature. What is their nature? And that is clear and knowing, or clear and cognizant, totally non-physical, non-material, and just awareness of objects. And also impermanence, the fact that the mind is impermanent, so each moment of mind arises and passes, and doesn't last more than a very tiny fraction of a moment. I have a transcript of a commentary that was given by Geshe Rabta, one great Lama who lived in Switzerland for many years. So he gave probably a weekend course, because it's relatively short, on the 4 establishments of mindfulness. I think he was using Jetsun Chökyi Gyaltsen's text. And he said that in Tibet, the monks, when they were studying this topic, they would meditate. They would practice these 4 while they were studying, while they were learning about them. And in the book, Following the Buddha's Footsteps, His Holiness explains various ways of practicing mindfulness on the mind. For example, on the conventional nature of mind, the clear and knowing nature, the impermanent nature of the mind, and so on. So we'll look at those a little bit later. But first I'd like to just mention in the Pali tradition how mindfulness of the mind is practiced. And this is based on the Satipatthana Sutra, the Buddha's words on mindfulness. And he mentions 16 different mental states, which are divided into 8 pairs. And so I'll just briefly mention these. The first 3 or possibly 4 pairs should be familiar to us, because they are mental states that are either with or free of afflictions. And so here we can see how mindfulness of feelings kind of leads naturally to mindfulness of the mind, because it's feelings that lead to the different afflictive states of mind. So the first pair is with desire or without desire. So in place of desire, some translations have attachment or greed or lust or passion. Those are different terms used by different translators for this particular state of mind. So I just decided to use desire. And so desire or attachment is one of the afflictive states of mind, one of the delusions, one of the main causes of suffering. And it's a mental factor. It's one of the afflictive mental factors, one of the 6 root afflictions. And being a mental factor, it can't exist on its own, right? It can't just be free-floating all by itself, but it always accompanies a main mind. So which type of main mind can it accompany? Can it accompany sense consciousnesses? Can we have desire with our, visual consciousness and hearing and smelling and so on? I guess there's different opinions about that, because Vasubandhu, one of the great Indian masters who wrote the Abhidharmakosha, but that's explaining the Vaibhashika school's assertions. So in that text he says, yes, desire and aversion, hatred and so on can accompany sense consciousnesses. But his brother Asanga says no. No. Desire, the afflictive states of mind can only accompany mental consciousness, and probably only conceptual consciousness, concepts. And the Tibetans generally seem to accept that point of view. So this first of the mental states, a mind with desire, would be a mental consciousness, and the mental factor of desire or attachment is accompanying that, as part of that. If you remember from studying low rig, each moment of mind consists of a primary mind and a number of mental factors, and they're all together in one package. They can't be separated. So you can never have mental factors by themselves without a primary mind, and you also can't have a primary mind by itself without mental factors. So they're kind of all stuck together. One nature. They're all one nature in that particular moment. So a mind, a mental state with desire would be a mental consciousness with included in its retinue this mental factor of desire or attachment. And if desire is present in that mind, the whole mind and all the other mental factors take on the flavor of attachment. They all become flavored by attachment. So they're all afflicted just at that moment. And so for us to be able to be mindful of a mental state with desire, we need to know the characteristics of attachment or desire so that we can recognize it when it's there. And probably most of you have heard a description numbered of times of what is a desire attachment, but I'll just repeat it anyway. So one definition is that it's a mental factor, and it's based on distorted attention that exaggerates the attractiveness of an object, and it's a polluted object or a contaminated object, like another person's body, for example. So what usually happens is we see a body and we may have a pleasant feeling with it, and then that can turn into desire or attachment. And so what happens is the mind will exaggerate good qualities, attractive qualities of that object, and maybe even project things that aren't even there, so that the mind comes to see that object as much more beautiful, much more wonderful, much more desirable than it really is. And so it's all happening under the influence of ignorance and misconceptions, not seeing things as they are. And then full-blown desire or attachment wants the object. I want that. I want to get close to it. I want to own it. I want to keep it with me as much as possible so that I can have these nice feelings that I get from it. So we can get attached to just about anything. It could be a person, a body, a material object. It could also be more abstract things like ideas or experiences, like traveling, going to different places and seeing different things and trying different foods and so on. So those experiences of newness and so on, adventures. So just about anything could be an object of desire. And the function of desire attachment is to produce discontent. You always get dissatisfied eventually with the object. It doesn't continue to satisfy us forever. And to perpetuate the cycle of existence. So it's one of the main things that keeps us stuck in cyclic existence, like the Ferris wheel, the merry-go-round going around and around and around. That's one of the main obstacles to attaining nirvana, liberation, enlightenment. So we need to know what desire is so we can recognize it in our mind, and then we can recognize when our mind is with desire, when there's desire present in our mind, and we can also then know when desire is absent. It's the second of the pair, when our mind is free of desire, free of attachment. The second pair is with aversion, without aversion. And so aversion could be called by other names like anger, hatred, hostility, and so on. And so this is a mental factor that, well, one definition that we have, it says it refers to one of three objects. So the three objects are oneself, a friend, or an enemy. An enemy could be just somebody we dislike or we disagree with, or someone who's actually harmed us or wants to harm us. So those are the three objects. And the mind gets agitated by being unable to bear this object or wanting to harm this object or person. So that's not completely clear, but the three objects can be expanded to 9. Like they say, there's 9 different ways we could get angry, or different reasons we could have for anger. With regard to another person, thinking that person harmed me in the past, or is harming me now, or imagining they will harm me in the future. So that's the first 3. And then with regard to our dear friends, our relatives, if somebody is harming any of them, did harm them in the past, is harming them in the present, or will harm them in the future. So it's another 3 reasons for getting angry. And then the last 3 are with regard to enemies, the people we don't like. So if somebody helps my enemy, has helped in the past, is helping in the present, or will help in the future, then, so these are like 9 different reasons or 9 different bases for getting angry, for anger arising, hostility arising. So that's one way of explaining anger. But yeah, we might be able to come up with other ways, other reasons for anger arising in our mind. Like somebody may not be actually harming me, but I just find them annoying. Although I suppose our mind could say, well, that is harming me. I don't like the way they talk, or the way they laugh, or the way they chew their food, or whatever. It's harming me. It's disturbing me, making me unhappy. So yeah, so our mind can come up with all these conceptions as to why we feel justified in having aversion, anger, hatred for another person. It usually arises for other people, other beings, sometimes maybe towards inanimate object, like a machine, a car, a computer that's not working the way you want it to. You could get angry at that. That maybe in that moment you are relating to that machine as if it was like a person, as if it was an enemy that's harming you. So anger is a very disturbing state of mind, as we all know, and it can lead us to act in ways that create non-virtuous karma, more suffering for ourselves. It can also motivate us to harm others, and so on. And again, it's one of the things that keeps us in samsara, suffering again and again. So again, we need to be able to recognize anger and aversion, and so that we can know when there's a mental state with aversion, and then we can also recognize when it's absent, when our mind is free, temporarily. All of these are temporary, all of these are transitory. And then the third pair says, with delusion, without delusion. So in the Pali tradition, they use the word delusion as pretty much interchangeable with confusion about the way things exist, what we would normally call ignorance, not seeing things in the correct way as they really are. So for example, things which are impermanent, but we see them as permanent. Things that are absent of a self, but we see them as having a self, and so on. So all those different wrong views or wrong ways of seeing things are included in delusion. So that's more subtle, not as easy to recognize as desire and aversion. But the more we practice and get familiar with our mind and with the delusions in our mind, we can recognize when our mind is with delusion or without delusion. So those are the three poisons. Those first three are mental states with the three poisons and without the three poisons.
I realize it gets tricky whenever we try to maybe mix and match across traditions, but I don't necessarily see how I could practice that mindfulness if I'm thinking in terms of ignorance of inherent existence. My mind always is perceiving things as existing inherently. Mm-hmm. So how, like if we were to practice this like from a Madhyamaka point of view, how could we maybe take that one?
Well, I mean, in the Pali tradition, they wouldn't acknowledge that seeing things as inherently existing is a form of delusion or ignorance. So I think in their view, the examples that I came across were like seeing things as permanent when they're in fact impermanent, or seeing that there's a self, an I, a real, substantially existent self or I, when in fact there isn't one. So, like this list of 8 pairs of mental states is in the Satipatthana Sutra, and the Tibetans do have that sutra, but it doesn't seem to be the thing that they study. So they seem to study the commentaries based on the Indian masters like Sangye and Vasubandhu and so on. So, but I think it is helpful to know both traditions. Okay, the next pair, number 4, contracted and distracted. There's different opinions about the meaning of contracted. In Joseph Goldstein's book, he says it's the inner withdrawal of the mind due to sloth and torpor. And so it's a mind that's withdrawn, dull, low in energy. Sorry. And it sounds like what we normally call laxity or sinking, like in the teachings on calm abiding. We're trying to develop shamatha, calm abiding, or serenity. And sometimes the mind is just sort of dull and not very bright and alive and vivid and clear and so on. So it sounds like that. And then distracted is when the mind is restless and agitated and can't sit still, can't stay on the object. And so we would, if we're doing calm abiding practice, then we would be able to notice those when the mind is contracted or when the mind is distracted. So again, that pair we can probably notice when we're doing meditation, especially if we're trying to meditate after lunch, after eating a big meal, then the mind can be quite heavy. And distraction is a very common problem, at least for me. So especially if we're busy doing a lot of things, then when we sit down and meditate, we keep thinking about all those things. It's very hard to stay focused. Then the last 4 pairs are related more to mental states that one would experience on the path. And so we may not have any experience of these at this point, but maybe we can recognize their absence. So number 5 is developed and non-developed. And Bhante Gunaratana in his book says a developed mind can sometimes be experienced in meditation. The mind is harmonious, relaxed, serene, bright, and balanced. So your meditation is working and you're having some good experiences there. When we come out of meditation, our mind returns to normal, not developed. So that was his explanation of those. But probably the real meaning of developed is a higher level of mind as a result of practicing and gaining concentration. And then the next one, supreme and not supreme. Again, Bhante Gunaratana says a supreme mind is attained in states of deep concentration, like the jhanas. So that's after calm abiding, after shamatha, serenity. So very high level of concentration. And then number 7, concentrated and not concentrated. So that one we may have some little tastes of, because sometimes in our meditation we are able to keep our mind focused on one object for a period of time without interruption. But then when that's not the case, when our mind is not concentrated, then that's the second one. And he says, instead of getting upset at ourselves when our mind is not concentrated, we should just take note of this state of mind. And that way we improve our mindfulness. And eventually we can attain better concentration. So with all of these, we should really try to avoid beating ourselves up if we notice the presence of desire or the absence of concentration and so on and so forth. But the point of the practice of mindfulness is to just notice, to just be aware, be attentive to these different states of mind, but without self. I'll say a little bit more about that in a bit when I finish. So then number 8 is liberated and not liberated. And the book Following in the Buddha's Footsteps says this doesn't refer to nirvana, it doesn't mean the liberation of nirvana, because this practice of mindfulness of the mind is practiced to attain nirvana. So it's practiced prior to nirvana. But that book doesn't really explain what it means, liberated and not liberated. But Bhante Gunaratana just says, liberated means free of problems and afflictions, and that we might have brief moments of this, maybe moments when we're not feeling disturbed, unhappy, upset about anything. But those moments don't last, so problems return quite quickly. But at least, he says, at least we can learn to recognize that our mind is not liberated much of the time, and that this is painful, so that we aspire for liberation. We aspire to be free of suffering and problems and afflictions, which are the cause of them. So we're probably more likely to notice the first 4 pairs of mind, but not the last 4 until we achieve higher states of mind. And in Joseph Goldstein's book on the 4 foundations of mindfulness, he talks about the Western habit of beating ourselves up when we do notice delusions or afflictions in our mind. Like we think, I'm a bad person because I am angry or because I have desire. So instead of thinking like that, we need to train ourselves to think, there is anger in my mind. It's just an impermanent mental state, like a cloud going through the sky, and not me. So when we do notice the presence of any of the poisonous states of mind, the afflictive states of mind, the lack of concentration and so forth, then that's a more healthy response, is to understand that these mental states are transitory, not permanent. They're not who we are. They're just like the weather. Sometimes the sky is clear without clouds, other times there's clouds, but the clouds are not a permanent part of the sky. They come and go. So in the same way, these afflictions that appear in our mind come and go. They're not who we are. They're impermanent. And so try to not identify with them and then get into self-criticalness because they're there in the mind. But he says, on the other hand, it is important to recognize the faults and shortcomings of like these afflictive states of mind, how they lead to suffering for ourselves, they perpetuate our existence in samsara, and they're an obstacle to attaining liberation, enlightenment, and so on. So really be clear about their faults and their shortcomings. And then the opposite states of mind, like opposite to desire would be non-attachment, opposite to aversion would be loving kindness and compassion and so on. Opposite to confusion or delusion is wisdom. So know that there are opposite states of mind that are positive and helpful, and they're the cause of happiness and of spiritual growth. So put our energy into cultivating those. And Bhante Gunaratana, in his book, shared the Buddha's advice on what to do when we do notice one of the unwholesome states of mind, one of the afflictive states of mind. So there's a list of 6 different things we could do. The first one is to replace it with something wholesome. So if we're feeling angry at somebody or critical of somebody, we recognize that that state of mind is faulty, and so we replace it by, for example, focusing on the good qualities of that person, or cultivating love and compassion for that person. So try to generate a positive state that is a counter measure to that negative one. And number 2, if it doesn't go away, contemplate the suffering that it causes. Recognize that that state of mind leads to nothing but suffering and problems and doesn't bring anything good, so that you really see clearly that that is not a state of mind you want to indulge in and perpetuate. The third thing, if it still doesn't go away, is to ignore. Although it's talking more about the object that's triggering that affliction. So, for example, if there's a person or an object that triggers your attachment or your aversion, you can just not pay attention to it. Put your mind on something else. So it's similar to a person who's a recovering alcoholic and really trying to avoid drinking. It's better for that person not to go to bars, not to look at alcohol or people drinking alcohol. Look at something else instead. Otherwise, those kind of places and situations will trigger your desire for drinking. So I think that's the meaning of ignore. Just ignore what it is that's triggering that particular state of mind. And then number 4 is to remember that it's impermanent. So just remind yourself this is not a permanent state of mind. It's temporary, transitory, it will pass. So that's helpful to take the strong energy out of it. Number 5 is overpower it. Use all your energy to overcome it or crush it. I remember reading certain passages in the Buddha's sutras where he would talk about that, just or at least not letting your mind be taken over by that particular affliction. And then number 6, cultivate positive states of mind. So the more we familiarize our minds with the opposite states, such as loving kindness, which is the opposite of aversion, non-attachment, which is the opposite of desire and attachment, and so on, then that will help to reduce those states of mind. So there's lots of antidotes that, if you haven't learned them already, there's places where you can. So this is in the Pali tradition, how to practice mindfulness of mind is to become aware of these 8 pairs of mental states. So now let's move on to look at His Holiness's explanation of practicing mindfulness of the mind from the book Following in the Buddha's Footsteps. So the next slide. He mainly spoke about 3. The first one is mindfulness of the impermanence of the mind. So I'll just read what the book says about that. He says, mindfulness of the mind helps to overcome the distortion of believing what is impermanent to be permanent. The mind of the past is now gone. The mind of the future is yet to come. There is only the present mind, but this too is ever changing and does not remain in the next nanosecond. So I think it's probably better, instead of using the term mind in singular, it's more realistic to use it in the plural form, minds. Because if we just say mind, then it's easy to think we have just one mind that's sitting inside of us and it's kind of always the same. But in reality, our mind is like a stream that's made up of momentary mental states, momentary mental events. Each of these just arises and immediately ceases, just like a bubble. And then it's immediately replaced by the next one, and so on and so on and so on. So there's just this continuously flowing, continuously changing stream of mental states or mental events. And so we actually have many minds. And so, like what His Holiness says here, the mind of the past, which can mean just one moment before the present, okay, but it could also mean 20 years ago, minds that we experienced 20 years ago, 10 years ago, yesterday, and so on. So those minds are minds of the past, and they're gone. They're not there anymore. Even the minds of this morning, this afternoon, just one moment before this moment. So those minds are past minds, and they're already gone, they're already over. And then future minds, we will have experiences in the future, 5 minutes from now, 1 hour from now, tomorrow, next week, next year, and so on and so forth. So there will be minds that will arise in the future, but they're not there yet. And so there's only the present mind. But the present mind, if we try to analyze that, as soon as we look at the present mind, it's already gone. So he says, each moment of mind arises, abides, and disintegrates simultaneously. We often hear the advice to stay in the present moment, but when is the present moment? No sooner has it arisen than it has ceased. If we try to isolate and examine one moment of mind, we find it has a beginning, a middle, and an end. Which is the present part of that moment? When does the mind abide? If we say the middle part is the present moment, we face the same quandary because it too has a beginning, a middle, and a final portion. So any, tiny part of mind or mental state or mental experience that we have, if we try to pinpoint it and say, this is the present moment, then in fact it could be divided into past, present, and future, or beginning, middle, and end. And it's very hard to pinpoint. As soon as you try to pinpoint it, it's already gone. So this is talking about the subtle impermanence of the mind, the fact that the mind is changing constantly in every nanosecond, every tiny fraction of time. But there's also coarse impermanence. So I was thinking, does the mind have coarse impermanence? Does coarse impermanence apply to the mind? Because coarse impermanence usually is when something goes out of existence, like when a person dies, or a building collapses or burns down, a leaf dies and falls from the tree. So coarse impermanence is impermanence that's visible, that we can perceive. So I was wondering if we can talk about the coarse impermanence of the mind. And in one way, it doesn't seem right because the mind will never end. The mind will not come to an end. The mind itself, the mental continuum, even though it's changing all the time, there is this continuum that keeps going and will keep going until enlightenment. It will never stop. It will never go out of existence. So in that sense, it doesn't have coarse impermanence. But on the other hand, if we talk about specific mental states, for example, anger or any of the other afflictions, they have an end. So the anger in our mind, that will end, thank goodness. There will be a time when there's no more anger arising in our mind. The Buddha did that. The Arhats have done that. High-level bodhisattvas have done that. So we can do it too. So we can talk about coarse impermanence in terms of a specific aspect of the mind, like the afflictions, ignorance, greed, hatred, and so on. Anyway, so then His Holiness goes on to talk about how awareness of the impermanence of the mind can help free us from fear of death. He says, mindfulness of this subtle, impermanent nature of the mind reduces fear of death. While actively dying, people often feel that they are becoming non-existent, and tremendous fear arises. This fear is based on self-grasping ignorance and feeds craving and clinging, which ripen the karmic seeds that propel another birth in samsara. So that fear can be a cause, a factor in continuing to take rebirth and remaining in samsara. Relaxing that fear gives us more opportunity to meditate and possibly gain deep realizations at the time of death. And then he says, understanding 2 points diminishes the fear of the self vanishing at death. So the first is, although a moment of mind does not remain in the next moment, the continuity of moments of mind is indestructible. So each moment of mind, each individual mental state only lasts a moment and then it's gone. It's no longer there in the next moment. But there's a continuity, a continuum of these moments of mind, and that's something indestructible. At least according to Mahayana Buddhism. According to Mahayana Buddhism, the mind will never end. It cannot be destroyed. And I think it's because there's nothing that can destroy it. Even the most powerful weapons, atomic bombs, nuclear bombs, chemical weapons, they can't destroy the mind. So what could destroy the mind? Is there anything that could destroy it, that could make it cease and become non-existent? So there isn't. So even becoming enlightened or attaining nirvana. That's not the end of the mind. The mind continues in a state of enlightenment, a state of nirvana. So the mind will continue. And then the second point, he says, is the I is designated in dependence on the mind. So since the mind, or at least the continuum, mental continuum, will keep going after death and life after life after life, all the way up to nirvana enlightenment. And the I, the conventional I, is designated, imputed on the mind. That's the main basis of imputation. You know, sometimes we say the I is designated in dependence on the aggregates, all of our 5 aggregates. But the main basis of designation for the I is the mind, especially the mental consciousness, because that's what continues life after life. Our body is left behind, our ordinary feelings and thoughts and so on of this life are left behind, but the mental consciousness, a subtle mental consciousness, goes on to future lives. So that's the basis on which I is designated. And so since the mental consciousness will go on and go all the way up to nirvana enlightenment, then there's no need to worry, I am going out of existence. Especially if we understand what the I is, the conventional I, the merely labeled I. So that will continue. So he says, by maintaining mindfulness on the mind, we will be able to perceive directly its subtle changing nature and understand that even though the mind is transient, its continuity continues. Let's just pause here and do a little bit of meditation on this, because I think it's quite powerful and not that difficult to understand. Not as difficult as emptiness, but understanding the impermanence of the mind can be very, very helpful. So start with a few minutes of being aware of the breath coming in and going out. And make sure your mind is in the present, right here, right now, not thinking about the past or the future or other places. And then expand your awareness so that you can notice the flow of perceptions, like 5 sense perceptions, hearing sounds, feeling sensations in the body, maybe smelling odors or tasting something in your mouth, and thoughts, memories. Just whatever's happening moment by moment in your mind, just notice it without clinging to any of these experiences. Just let them arise and pass. So see if you can notice how transitory all these experiences are. They arise, they last only a moment, then vanish, disappear, the next one arises, and so on. So nothing in the mind is permanent, fixed, always there, always the same. And even though each individual mental state, moment of experience arises and passes, but there's a continuity, a continuum of these moments. But when one mind arises and ceases, it becomes the cause for the next one, transforms into the next one. And so the mind doesn't totally cease or go out of existence. It just changes moment by moment. And this continuum or continuity of moments of mind will go on forever. Nothing can destroy it. Nothing can make it go out of existence. And there will come a time one day when it will become enlightened mind. Blissful, free of all afflictions and faults. Pure and peaceful. And able to work for the benefit of all beings. So as in the words of Shantideva, as long as space remains, as long as sentient beings remain, I too will remain to dispel the misery of the world. Then the second of the practices of mindfulness of mind, explained by His Holiness, is on the conventional nature of the mind. And what that refers to is the nature of the mind being clear and knowing, or clear and cognizant. And he talks about how to recognize this. He says we need to be in a very quiet situation, ideally without a lot of distractions and noise and so on, and then make our mind very calm. And then he says, stop the 5 sense experiences. That would be hard to do, but I guess it means at least ignore them. Don't let yourself pay attention to them. And also thoughts, stop the thoughts of the past and the future. In some places, I can't remember which books, he talks about a time when he was in Ladakh doing a retreat. And Ladakh, I haven't been there, but it must be a pretty quiet, peaceful place, way up in the mountains, like in Tibet. So he was probably in a cave or a little hut somewhere and really meditating. And he was able to get this experience of the nature of the mind. And so then he says, initially we may feel the mind is nothing, void, thoughtless. When we are able to prolong this time of not remembering the past or thinking about the future, we might get a glimpse of voidness. There's a gap in which the arising of mental elaborations and manifestations of the coarser level of mind have stopped. An experience of stillness arises because the senses are not active, and there is just the experience of the present, of a void. But this void is not the emptiness of inherent existence, it is an openness. And when this gap is sustained, we may get a glimpse of the mere, clear and cognizant nature of mind. Only then have we found for the first time the object of meditation for practicing mindfulness of the mind. Become familiar with this experience. So it sounds like not easy. We have to be in very specific situation, and I mean being able to, I don't know about you, but for me to be able to stop thoughts of the past and the future and paying attention to sensory experiences, that's quite hard to do. But being able to do that will enable one to then go deeper in the mind and recognize this clear and knowing nature of the mind. And then he says, as meditation continues, we become aware of two things. First, the natural state of the mind is free from both destructive emotions, such as animosity, and constructive emotions, such as compassion. All our emotions are not the very nature of the mind. When I read that, I was quite surprised, because I think I had thought, oh yeah, I can understand that the afflictions, the anger, the attachment, and so on, those are not in the nature of mind. This is what we're being told all the time. They are adventitious, they can be cleared away, they're not permanent. But somehow I had the thought that, but the positive emotion, compassion and love, those must be in the nature of the mind. But he says, no, even the positive emotions are not the very nature of the mind. They too are transitory and adventitious. So he says, emotions, including the positive ones, arise due to causes and conditions, but they do not exist in the very nature of the mind. So the nature of the mind is neutral. So he says, through experiencing this, we see that the very nature of the mind is neutral. So it's neither positive nor negative. Although it can be influenced by constructive and destructive emotions, these emotions are adventitious and temporary. But seeing this neutral nature of the mind, we understand it is possible to put an end to mental defilements. So once we do get a glimpse of that nature of the mind and see for ourselves that, yeah, it's neutral and the disturbing emotions are not fixed, permanent parts of it, then we understand, oh, they can be ceased. We can put an end to them. So that must be quite powerful. So that's the first insight. And the second is that the mind is momentary and fluctuating. And thus, whatever thoughts accompany the mind are also momentary. They do not last a second moment. from this point of view also we can understand that it is possible to abandon mental defilements, the afflictions. So they can be abandoned because they're not permanent, fixed parts of the mind. And this leads to a discussion of emptiness and selflessness, which will come later. But in summary, through these two insights, that emotions are not in the very nature of the mind and that thoughts are transient, we see the possibility of eliminating mental defilements and know that attaining true cessations is possible. So this is how mindfulness of the mind leads to understanding true cessations, the third truth. So maybe I'll just do a little bit more, this one more point, although it's a big one. Mindfulness of the emptiness of the I. And so His Holiness says, when we try to focus mindfulness on the present moment of the mind, we can't find it. We can't find the present. In any moment of mind, half of it is already past and half is yet to come. The present moment can't be pinpointed. The mind is unfindable when sought with ultimate analysis. And he says, Nagarjuna talks about this in his treatise on the middle way, chapter 2, examination of coming and going. And then he goes on to say, in another way, mindfulness of the mind helps to realize the selflessness of persons, selflessness of I. And he says, our sense of I is sometimes related to our body. For example, when we have thoughts like, I'm a man, or I'm a woman, or I'm tall, short, fat, thin. So there our sense of I is more related to our body. Or when we talk about things that we're doing with our body, I'm cooking, I'm gardening, I'm building a house. So then our sense of I is more connected with our body. But sometimes our sense of I is more related to our mind. For example, when we say, I'm a Buddhist. Well, it's not our body that's a Buddhist, it's our mind, because our mind accepts Buddha's teachings and takes refuge in Buddhism and so on. Or I'm a student, I'm a teacher, I'm a therapist. Or I'm happy, I'm unhappy, I'm depressed, and so on. So when we have those thoughts of I, then our sense of I is more related to our mind. But he says mindfulness helps dispel these notions. He says in the 4 establishments of mindfulness, we first meditate with mindfulness on the body, carefully reflecting on the characteristics of the body. Then we meditate with mindfulness on the mind, seeing the mind as momentary and transitory. On this basis, we gain understanding of the selflessness of the person. When investigating the nature of the body, it feels like there's a solid I that is investigating the body. I am meditating on the mindfulness of the body. Although the I appears to be inside the body, it also seems to be separate from the body. When meditating with mindfulness of feelings, it feels like there is a findable I who experiences pain and pleasure. This I too seems to be separate from the feelings it experiences. It is the experiencer or owner of the feelings. Yeah, so when we say, I have pain or I feel pain, it feels like there's two separate things, an I and then the pain that is felt. When meditating with mindfulness on the mind, it initially feels that our mind could be I, me, myself. But later we discover a subtler, neutral mind that becomes the object to investigate through mindfulness, like he was just talking about the conventional nature of the mind. Here, mind is the object of meditation, and that mind is now within the focus of mindfulness. At that time, we may wonder, where is the I now? Who is practicing mindfulness of the mind? We may have the feeling that the I is merely designated on the basis of the collection of mind and body. There's no independent I that is the owner of the body and mind. There's no inherently existing I that is meditating. So in this way, mindfulness of the mind leads to understanding the selflessness of persons. And for this reason as well, it enables us to understand true cessations. So it sounds like he's saying that when we're practicing these various types of mindfulness, first on the body and then on the feelings and on the mind, we become more aware of a sense of an I that is meditating, that is experiencing all of these things. And then if we explore, we examine that sense of I and try to see if it's something existing on its own independently, as it seems to be, then we don't find it. And so this leads us to understanding selflessness of a person, the I. And that way also helps us understand true cessations, the third noble truth. So that's part of what he's saying. It goes on, but we're running out of time. So maybe I can stop here and see if there's any questions that anyone would like to ask on what I've covered so far.
Then there's a participant who has a question, I think. Please go ahead.
Mm-hmm. Who wants to ask the question?
Maybe the moment has passed.
Yeah. Anybody else?
Stephen, please go ahead.
Just disappeared. Go ahead. Maybe he'll come back.
So with this saying that that even the positive emotions are not part of the mind, part of the true nature of the mind.
The nature of the mind, yeah.
We call the afflictions disturbing conceptions. Is it the case then that love and compassion are positive conceptions?
Maybe in some cases. For example, when we're meditating on loving kindness and, contemplating, for example, the kindness of others. They've been my mother and my father, and they've provided me with food and all of these things. So that's definitely conceptual thinking, and that gives rise to this feeling of love. But whether love itself is a conception, I'm not sure. I mean, it's definitely a mental consciousness. It's not any of the five sense consciousnesses. I mean, I don't think it has to be conceptual, because in the mind of a Buddha, they say there's no conceptions. A Buddha's mind has no conceptions, but Buddha definitely has love and compassion. And so I think, they don't have to be conceptual. But on the other hand, like for me, I need to kind of think these different thoughts in order to generate that feeling of love. Sometimes it might just arise spontaneously by itself, but usually it's a process of conceptual thinking. So my guess is it could be conceptual, but not necessarily the positive states of mind.
Thank you.
Okay. Steve, is it Steve? Yeah.
Thank you, Venerable. You know, I emphasize this when His Holiness was talking about the mind and saying that it is completely neutral. And the emotions are all adventitious. I guess I got a little bit confused there. So I guess he's talking. First of all, we can say the mind is clear and knowing, or clear and luminous. So I guess that is that the neutral mind that he's talking about. He's not when he says emotions, he's referring to kind of the more sophisticated sensations that we have, either on a conceptual basis or maybe even a direct basis. What do you think about that?
Well, what comes to my mind is the emotions too are mind, and any mind, whether it's a primary mind or a mental factor, is made of the same stuff, clear and knowing, clear and cognizant. That is the nature of every single aspect of our mind, even the afflictions, even anger, it's clear and knowing. But it's not a permanent part of the mind. It's not something that's going to be there forever. And even now, it's not always there. We don't always have anger. So it's something that comes and goes. But it too its nature is clear and knowing. That's the very definition of mind, is that which is clear and knowing. And then that definition or that nature covers all of our mental states, main minds and mental factors. So, I don't fully understand myself. I've always been baffled when it comes to the mind. I learn all these words and I can repeat all these words, but then when it comes to really understanding them, it's still like, oh, I don't know. But I think that, saying that the like when he was talking about recognizing the conventional nature of the mind, you making the mind very, very quiet and stopping the thoughts of the past and future and the sense experiences. I think he's talking about like the mental consciousness, a specific type of mind. And he said, kind of going into a deeper level, a more subtle level of that, and recognizing just the clear cognizant nature of that mind. And I don't have that experience myself, so I can't speak from firsthand
Sure.
experience. And it sounds like it's not such an easy experience to get to. You have to be, quite a special situation. But they do say that when we die, we go through this process of dissolution of the grosser, coarser levels of the mind, like the five senses. They all kind of dissolve and stop functioning as we're dying. And then our gross thoughts as well, thoughts related to this life, they also cease. And this is the tantric explanation, of course, but then they talk about the mind going to this very subtle level of what they call the innate mind of clear light. And that's a type of mental consciousness. It's not any of the five sense consciousnesses. And that is the mind that passes from this life to the next. And its nature is clear and knowing, clear and cognizant. I don't know if this is answering your question or not, but
It is, but then it kind of made me think of something else, which is bodhicitta. But bodhicitta isn't a mental factor; it's an actual mind. So it's
main mind,
it's the main mind of other cherishing versus the main mind that I have now of self-cherishing. And so that's not really something you could call an emotion. And yet, it seems to be after a certain stage of spiritual development to be persistent. And so to me, that would color the mind, make it something other than neutral. I don't know. Maybe you have some insight on this that I don't.
Yeah, I mean, like I say, there's so many things about the mind I don't understand either. And when I read this in the book, I was surprised myself,
Well, yes, yeah.
you know, that the nature of the mind is neutral, and even the positive emotions like love and compassion and bodhicitta are not in the nature of the mind. But then I was thinking, in the case of a Buddha, um, in the Buddhist mind, love and compassion would be there all the time. I don't think there's ever a moment when the Buddha's mind is without those positive emotions. But maybe the point is they're still adventitious in the sense that they depend on causes and conditions. You know, the Buddha spent many, many, many lifetimes cultivating his compassion and his love and his bodhicitta. And so as a result of that, those states of mind are there constantly at the state of enlightenment. I really don't know. I'm sorry. I can't.
Yeah. It sounds plausible to me. That's how I was thinking too, that if you were to develop the mind of bodhicitta, while the emotions might be temporary and maybe return to a neutral state, they would naturally, spontaneously arise. The positive emotions, like you mentioned, about compassion and all of the other perfections as well, would spontaneously arise in that mind of other cherishing.
Sorry. But it's something to continue thinking about and exploring and investigating and trying to understand. It's so important. I mean, understanding the mind is the most important thing. That's the thing that will continue beyond this life and all the way up to enlightenment. That is what will become enlightened mind in the future. So understanding the mind and exploring the mind and working on the mind is very, very important, crucial. So, yeah.
Would you say that mental factors and conception are equivalent?
No, not
No.
all mental factors.
But some might be.
If you have a conceptual mind, if I'm thinking about something, for example, that's a conceptual mind. So together with that mind, there are mental factors. Feeling, there's always feeling and discrimination, and there could be other things as well. So I would think that the mental factors that are accompanying a conceptual mind would also be conceptual because they have the same object. That's just my thought about that. But the mental factors accompanying a sense perception, which is a non-conceptual mind, would be non-conceptual. So I think they would take on that mode of whatever the main mind is. But they themselves are neither conceptual or non-conceptual. Although I think anger, I mean, I have read and heard in some cases like the afflictions, like anger and attachment and so on, those are always conceptual. There's always conceptions involved in them. He did this, she did that, she's bad, she's horrible, and so on.
Trying to sort out is does the mental factor arise on the basis of conception, or is the mental factor of anger conception itself?
I think both. I think it does arise. Well, I mean, it arises from seeds. We have seeds of anger in our mind, and that's what triggers. But there's these thoughts, like it says, he harmed me in the past, he's harming me now, he will harm. So there's thoughts going on that seem to trigger that seed. That's as much as I know. If I come up with other answers to these questions, I'll share them next week. But we better finish now. We've come to the end of our time. So let's end by dedicating the merit, the positive energy of coming together with a positive motivation and spending this time looking at these very precious teachings on the four establishments of mindfulness, which are an important practice, essential practice for the attainment of nirvana and enlightenment. So let's share this positive energy with all other beings, wishing that they will meet the teachings as well and be able to transform their minds, free their minds from the affliction as the cause of all suffering, and develop all the positive qualities that will enable them to become free of suffering and enlightened. Due to the merits of these virtuous actions, may I quickly attain the state of a Guru Buddha and lead all living beings without exception into that enlightened state. May the supreme jewel bodhicitta that has not arisen arise and grow, and may that which has arisen not diminish, but increase more and more. Incomparably kind and supreme Tenzin Gyatso, the wish-fulfilling, wish-granting jewel, source of every benefit and happiness in this world, may you have a long life and all your holy wishes be spontaneously fulfilled. You who uphold the subduer's moral way, who serve as the bountiful bearer of all, sustaining, preserving, and spreading Manjunath's victorious doctrine, who masterfully accomplish magnificent prayers honoring the three sublime ones, Savior of myself and others, your disciples, please, please live long. Thank you, Paola, for
Very much,
hosting.
Anita.
Thanks everyone for joining. Bye.